Welcome to What Matters Now, a weekly podcast from the Times of Israel. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Hi, Haviv. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda. Good to be here.
It's so nice to see you back in your home. And we are here to conduct kind of a part two to a discussion that we began last week on our daily series, The Daily Briefing, which we called Excruciating Dilemmas as Murderers Set to be Released. And we both received quite a lot of feedback, one because of our conversation about where bagels are originated and where they are king, but also because of one particular point that neither of us mentioned in terms of this terrible dilemma of the terrorists who are being set free as part of this ceasefire hostage release deal. Haviv, how many responses did you get pointing to the death penalty?
A dozen.
A dozen, same, at least.
Yeah.
And the death penalty is, of course, something that Israel does not outlaw, but it doesn't also uphold very often. And there are, in fact, only two cases, as far as I know, in which people were executed in some way. And one is the most famous case, of course, and that's Eichmann. Tell us a little bit, just very briefly, about this case, Haviv.
Adolf Eichmann was one of the planners, one of the Nazi bureaucrats who actually literally planned the genocide. Someone involved in Hungary in the genocide and in other places. And he escaped, like many Nazis, to Argentina in 1960. He was discovered. There was a manhunt for him. And he was kidnapped in 1960 by Mossad agents in Argentina and brought to Israel and put on trial. It was a very public trial. It was a very dramatic trial. Israeli society never quite knew what to make of the sheer scale of the Holocaust, of the helplessness of Jews in the Holocaust, which seemed so antithetical to what Israeli Jews thought of themselves as being. And they learned, Israeli Jews in that trial, how much subversion, how much propaganda the Nazis used, how the Jews really didn't know what to expect. And in the end, the judges passed down a death sentence. And Eichmann was killed by Israel, was executed. And it was the last time, 1962, that anyone was executed by the Israeli legal system. There was the Demjanjuk trial where he was convicted, but then that was overturned in the Supreme Court on the question of, so the actual death sentence was never issued. It's basically the only death sentence Israel has. I mean, there's some legal technicalities attacking the Jewish people in wartime as a whole, the Jewish people as a whole, is also a crime subject to a death penalty if prosecutors seek that death penalty, and that arguably could be applied to October 7, for example. But these are legal theories. The last time Israel actually executed someone was 1962, and there was a principled opposition. Very early on, I think it was 52 or 53, the Knesset actually outlawed execution for murder. So that is something that hasn't happened, since the very founding of the state. That's it.
Did you? I was not aware of this first case that I'm going to mention right now of a summary execution. Essentially, there was an IDF officer called Meir Tobiansky, who in 1948 was executed for treason, and he was accused by Iser Be'eri, who was the head of the then newly established military intelligence. And there was a case in which there was suspicion that he was basically spying for Jordan. He was arrested on June 30th, 1948 in Tel Aviv and was executed by a firing squad that same day after this really, makeshift court-martial. He was 44 years old, and his widow went to David Ben-Gurion, who was, of course, the founding prime minister, and Ben-Gurion ordered an investigation into this case, and he was, of course, Tobiansky was found not guilty. Recently, in the past several years, a street in Jerusalem was named after him, and following this investigation back in the late 1940s, Tobiansky's body was taken to Mount Herzl, But these are really the only two cases that I knew about. Eichmann and Tobiansky, I just learned about this morning. Many Israelis will remember him. But since then, as you said, although it is still on the books, there has been no execution. And as you said, there is a mechanism in which the October 7th terrorists could be considered under this ruling. So let's talk about this a little bit, Haviv. In terms of Judaism, of course, in the Torah, there were many mentions of death penalty, and Talmudic sources talk about it a lot. I spoke with I reached out to my friend Rabbi Menachem Creditor, and he sent me some sources which were very helpful. And even in the Shulchan Aruch, the guiding playbook of halakha, Jewish law, there is mention and some kind of mechanism for death penalty. But in Israel, it hasn't been happening, as we said. And in fact, in most of the, shall we say, quote unquote, enlightened nations, and not only that of the world, many, many, many of these nations have outlawed the death penalty, which, as we said, Israel has not done. But in recent years, in the past decade, there have been bills brought to have this death penalty idea brought more into focus, especially from Israel Beitenu, for example. Do you remember when this happened? I think it was 2015 or so.
I think it was in the party. It was in the party's platform in the 2015 election. It was something that Avigdor Lieberman had spoken about earlier, and there are others. If I'm not mistaken, Moledet, the far-right party from 20 years ago, used to talk about these kinds of things. But the death penalty in Judaism generally is extraordinarily rare. There's a statement in the Talmud that a rabbinical court that sentenced someone to death more than once every 70 years was considered a murderous court. And so a death penalty really is supposed to be, in Judaism, even though there are many cases in the Bible and in Jewish law generally in which a death penalty is a possibility on the spectrum of punishment, humans are not said to be able to deliver that penalty properly because there's no perfect justice in a human justice system. And so that's a very old principle.
Not to interrupt you, but to interrupt you, at the same time, when this Talmudic discussion was taking place, with the Sanhedrin, etc., there was no sovereign state, right? It's a very different thing when you have a hypothetical conversation when you can't actually carry out the death penalty. But we're in a different era right now, and Israel is a sovereign nation. And so it is a conversation that you hear starting to filter through, as you said, mostly in the far-right sectors of the political sphere.
Yeah, look, right now, the reason we're talking about it, of course, is hostages. One of the ways in which Israel has incentivized taking hostages at a mass scale that we saw on October 7, and which currently, as they're being released, Israelis are being reminded of who Hamas is, what Hamas did to them. It's not that anyone forgot, but life moved on, and people have had a war to deal with, and the economy to deal with, and everyone's sacrifices over the course of the last 16 months. And now we're seeing the crowds the very day we're recording in Khan Yunis in the release of El Bel Yahud, just screaming and braying and trying at their very last moment as a propaganda exercise by Hamas to torment the hostages one last time. And people are starting to, people have been since October 7, but they're starting once again to ask seriously. And it's not just on the far right. It's also in the center and in the center right. And I have seen more than one people they would consider themselves on the center left begin to contemplate these kinds of ideas, where some of the people being released are people serving multiple life terms for murder, for mass murder. And the question being asked is, well, if during their trial they could actually have a death penalty, they could be dead, there wouldn't be such an incentive to take hostages, would there? Because there'd be fewer prisoners to release. That's not something you can do for terror suspects that have no evidence and are arrested under administrative detention because when you do a sweep of administrative detention arrests for 3 months, a terror wave dies down, which is a very, very problematic and complex policy of Israel in places like the West Bank that I have written against. And the argument for is a very complex argument, and it's a very serious debate, and we're not opening it here. But for suspected potential people connected to terror organizations in some way, nobody is talking about death penalty there. But the pain is the release of these mass murderers and the absolute certainty that a great many of them, because we saw that in the Shalit deal in 2011, a great many of them, a double-digit percentage, returned to terrorism, and in fact that includes some of the top planners of October 7th. Well, if they were all dead, that would not have happened, is something that Israelis are starting to seriously talk about. And it's not entirely clear where that conversation is going, but, you know, there are things that can be said about the kinds of directions that Israel could go in that regard.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the figures that I'm hearing being thrown around is 82% of those who are being released in these prisoner releases are further violating and going to violence and committing further mass violence crimes. And I mean, it's everywhere, right? Yes, last week I discussed, just off the top of my head, a few people I know whose family members were killed in terror attacks. I was just reminded by a fellow coworker who we used to work with at a previous publication we both worked at, who was in a bus bombing 21 years ago. My eldest son was just 4 days old when I got the news that my good friend at work had been in a bus bombing and 11 people were killed in that bus bombing. His terrorist is potentially on the list right now. It's just all around us. But Haviv, we've discussed several times over the course of this war how Hamas is a death-like cult as well. And so I just really wonder if saving lives is really much of an incentive, meaning if you know that there's a possibility for the death penalty, does that actually mean that you won't become a terrorist?
So there's so much to say there. So first of all, the army's numbers are very complicated in terms of who's gone back to terror. Going back to belonging in some way to one of these ideological factions is not the same as returning to terror. The numbers for returning to terror are much lower. They're ballpark, it depends who you ask and which group of prisoners you're talking about is something like 20%, not 80%. 80% go back to being Hamas, but Hamas is a vast, sprawling bureaucracy. It has charities, huge charities, and it's half a society. It's much, much more than the actual military wing, so to speak, and terrorism. The actual number of terrorists who go back to violence is something like 20% of those released, and that is vastly too high. In other words, and again, it depends what you there are a lot of definitional questions here. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I don't share the way Israelis talk about Hamas as a death cult. They're not a cult. First of all, there's no brainwashing going on. They are a serious vision and version of Islam and Islamic ideology that has been developing and growing in the Arab Muslim world over the last 150 years. There's a tremendous battle within Arab Sunni Islam for the soul of Islam, for the meaning of Islam, for what explains Islam's current weakness and how Islam overcomes that weakness and comes surging back as a powerful force in history. And Hamas are part of that debate and take a position that is that they are the heirs to 150 years of one particular line in that larger debate. So we're not talking about a death cult. And when Hamas says things like, and if you think of them as a cult, the tools that you would use to break up a cult, therapy, don't work on Hamas, because they're a real and true, profound religious movement with a religious message. And so in a sense, they're much more resilient than a cult. And they can absolutely be defeated and erased, but they have to be defeated and erased like the redemptive ideology that they are, not like some cult. And so, when they say things like, and they say it all the time, and they say it from their leadership on down, The Jews love life and we love death, and therefore we're going to win. And the Jews all say, aha, you admitted we love life. What Hamas means is not that they literally enjoy death and hope for death. What they mean, what they're trying to say, what they understand in the coded language of their own discourse as saying is, we have faith. And because we have true and profound and absolute faith in God and God's plan for history, and therefore in God's plan for Islam's redemption through us, death is nothing more than the deepest commitment to God. Whereas the Jews are faithless, their religion, this is official dogma of most of Islam, and certainly of Hamas's Islam. Judaism is a big, gigantic lie. They got a divine revelation, but then they lied about it, and so Judaism is a giant lie, and they are faithless, and therefore they cling to life like desperate people hovering over a chasm, and so they live their lives in fear, whereas we live our lives in devotion. That is the argument Hamas makes. And
but
it is very
why
poetic
do you think that
and evocative.
They aren't being brainwashed at the same time? All these harsh truths, shall we say, that they hold for Jews are being taught to children in their schools. I mean, brainwashing is definitely part of it, or at least indoctrination, if you want to call it that.
Brainwashing describes certain tools in which you detach someone from their sense of reality, whereas culture is, and religion is much more culture than it is some kind of dogmatic sort of force feeding. Culture is how you together as a community sort of structure the normative reality around you through rituals, through shared language, through shared expectations and assumptions about the world. If you come at it from the perspective of death cult and brainwashing, which is a great way to talk about it when you kind of want to minimize it and critique it and mock it, fine, but that's not the right diagnosis. In other words, the right diagnosis is that we're dealing with a religious vision. Not Islam writ large, although not a small part of Islam is actually represented by Hamas's own Islamic vision, and that is what we face. And so it's a different kind of fundamental war. Fundamentally, it's a different kind of war. But my point is just that they are willing to take tremendous losses. Gaza's destruction was their fundamental war strategy. Right? If you think of Israelis as terrible, evil monsters, then the strategy of October 7 and the strategy of building the tunnels was nothing but a strategy of Gaza's destruction. So they're not only willing, they're eager to take on vast, vast death and damage. That's their fundamental strategic direction. But there is also in the Palestinian national movement and deep in Palestinian culture, and for generations now, a sacralization, sanctification of the question of the prisoners and of the question of people who sit in Israeli prisons for carrying out terror attacks. And they are lionized, and there's things named for them in Palestinian society. Not just, every suicide bomber that Palestinian society has ever produced, and that's hundreds of people, have something named after them in Palestinian society, and a great many prisoners have something named after them. And in the ideological factions, whether this is Fatah once upon a time or Hamas today, sitting in prison is almost a requirement to gain the kind of cachet, the kind of street cred that you need to rise up the ranks. So one of the reasons Sinwar was the leader of Hamas after coming out of an Israeli prison is that he sat in an Israeli prison. So there's this sacred element surrounding the question of the release of prisoners. And
there's
a lot
also,
of dozens,
Haviv, a sacred element surrounding the idea of the Shahid, the martyr, right? So if you put these two things together, I still don't see how the death penalty could be a deterrent for these people trying to get into prison.
Well, it wouldn't deter terror attacks at all. I think it would lower the value of hostages. You take a hostage because the Israelis told you in the Shalit deal that they'll give you 1,027 per hostage. You take a hostage now, the price has gone down, but you took so many hostages. What are the Israelis telling you? That they'll give you between 30 and 50, depending on whether they're soldiers or women, or, that they'll give you 30 to 50 per hostage. What if there aren't 30 to 50 or 1,027 per hostage? then the hostage's value is lower. And what if the worst ones, the ones we're releasing people with more than 10 life sentences for more than 10 murders per person. There are multiple people like that released in the Shalit deal, and there are mass murderers being released in this deal. Well, what if they were dead? Then we'd be releasing people who were much less likely to go and murder again because they're not mass murderers to begin with, right? That's the theory. That's the argument. I got to tell you, I am skeptical. I am skeptical that the Israeli state is going to start putting in place a kind of fast track, because if it takes 20 years to work through the system, which is what a death penalty would ordinarily take, or even 5 years to work through the system, you're still incentivizing hostage taking. So it would be a fast track, right? Multiple appeal death penalty. I don't know what to tell you. I'm skeptical that Israel has that legal culture, that Israelis want to start bringing in a guillotine, or poison injections or electric chairs. I don't think that's something that we're going to want to introduce into our prison system and into our judicial system. And so I don't know that that's something that Israel is culturally capable of doing, even if there's some pieces of legislation that MKs have presented over the last couple of years, basically as sort of, press releases and sort of trying to get attention. I don't think that's something that Israel is going to take on and going to move forward with. But there's another aspect to this question of having fewer living prisoners, especially the bad prisoners, to exchange for hostages, which is, I've tried to look up the data ahead of time. I couldn't find it. So I'm asking this as a question rather than as a statement. And I'm sure the data is out there, and I'm sure it just has to be parsed properly. I think that since the Shalit deal in 2011, the Israeli army has been less careful in its arrests. If it's going after mass murdering terrorist leaders, it pins them down and tries to take them out in a gunfight, and not use clever special forces to storm the place and take them, and capture them before they can be killed. It no longer tries as much as it used to before 2011 to take them alive. And I suspect, so one data point that made me curious about this was the relatively advanced age of the people being let out now. I don't think that's because of I don't think that's because of the Hamas demand. I think that's literally because those are the prisoners. There are actually fewer serious mass murdering prisoners, serious terrorist prisoners, who are younger. They tend to be killed in the very arrest operations that would have brought them to prison. Now, is that a policy? Is that a change in behavior of Israeli forces on the ground to keep soldiers from doing more dangerous things, like trying to take them alive? Is that the policy of Palestinians to die shooting rather than go to prison? If they've just committed a murder, they're going to prison for a long time, barring some hostage deal, right? I don't know, but I suspect, and the data will tell us this, that Israel has found not a solution, but a kind of workaround for the most egregious of potential prisoners that would be released in a hostage deal, which is that they're killed in the battlefield, and nobody tries to prevent them being killed in the battlefield.
We, the Holocaust survivors, are a rapidly diminishing group. We are in the last moments of being able to share with our young people our first-hand testimonies. Time is rapidly running out. Each year sees smaller numbers of survivors able to accompany students on the March of the Living. Marching with students and survivors from many countries in those terrible places allows our students to learn and understand through stories and eyewitness accounts about our resilience, our strength, and our determination.
This Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Day, many survivors like Ava want to march at the International March of the Living in Auschwitz. They need your help. to sponsor a survivor on the March of the Living, go to motl.org.
Are you seeing at the same time that more innocents are also being killed in the battlefield? Because that sounds like that would be the byproduct of, the pressure cooker system that the IDF places on homes in order to try and get the baddies out. We hear reports, often confirmed or unconfirmed, that civilians are being killed in this too. So I guess the question is, if this is some kind of de facto policy by the IDF, by Israeli politicians, is this something that the Israeli public is agreeing to live with?
So a lot of questions there that I don't know the answer to. There is a strategy. The pressure cooker strategy is where the army surrounds a particular place, where a building or a house where they know that this wanted terrorist is in, and then close in on them in ways that are fairly safe for the soldiers and don't leave many options to the person inside the building. And it's a tactic used in places like Jenin for arrests of very dangerous leaders of terrorist organizations in places like Jenin. But it is a tactic that is more dangerous for the terrorist and less dangerous for the soldier. I don't have evidence that, first of all, we're not talking about simple extrajudicial killings in the sense that they aren't caught and then shot in the head because nobody wants to bother with ever taking them to prison. That is not something we have evidence for. As a policy, it's not something we have evidence for outside of the actual war zones of Gaza, where I have no idea. I mean, we don't have, what actually happened within Gaza at every turn. How many Hamas we know many were captured by the Israeli soldiers. We don't know every detail of every gun battle. It's simply something I can't comment on because I literally have no data. In the West Bank, where there's a lot more information, where the arrests are done in ways that we know a great deal about, I'm not talking about extrajudicial killings. I'm talking about the army, a kind of informal, and I don't have evidence of this. I'll say more than that. It's not that I don't have evidence of this. I hope that's what's happening. And I think that most Israelis hope that's what's happening, and I think that it's the most sensible policy the army could pursue. If you murdered people and you engineered terror attacks, and taking you to prison is a strategic liability for the state of Israel because it incentivizes hostages and will eventually release you for those hostages, it is now a strategic benefit for you not to survive the gun battle in which you would potentially be arrested. And so your death is part of the war effort. It's part of the military operations goal. And I don't know if that's publicly articulated, but I think that that's the kind of thinking, based on who's being released now, based on the kind of fundamental change in who's actually in prison since Shalit, based on the experience of the Shalit detainees, the Shalit releasees, engineering October 7, for all of those reasons, and for everything we're seeing now with the release of our hostages in ways that are driving home to Israelis the monstrosity that is Hamas, I hope, and I am beginning to believe, and I'm still looking for the evidence to prove that in fact Israel does not take the most egregious murderous of terrorists alive. If it can, in battle, take them out.
And what you said earlier is it's quite possible that this is a mutual decision between Israel and the Palestinian terrorists themselves, who may prefer to go down in battle as well. Haviv, so much to think about. Definitely, it sounds like we're going to have a part 3 of this conversation sometime soon. Though I think we did wrap up the bagel conversation and really Jerusalem. That's where it's at, right?
Bagels invented in Jerusalem? Was that what we decided?
I think we're deciding that the best bagels in the world are now in Jerusalem.
I don't think so. I'm sorry. I love Jerusalem, but I don't think so.
Maybe I need to get out more. Haviv, again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to The Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.